Welcome back to Zuko Builds. Today we're making this huge base for a 9-foot dining table, and it's featuring some castle joints. It's too big to even get on camera, so I'm not going to bother to try to find the angle. You'll see what it looks like throughout the video. But the castle joints are really cool. Last week I made a little demonstration of me pretty much practicing the joint before I did it for a customer, and these came out great. Yeah, it's going to be a fun build today, so let's get right into it. I'll be using 4x4s for the table legs, and I always start by cutting one end off, making sure it's nice and square before measuring any of my dimensions. This table is going to be a total of 30 inches high, so I'm going to make these legs 28.5 inches to accommodate for the 1.5 inch thick top. Alright guys, so now that we have all 4 of our legs cut out, let's go ahead and clean these up. I'll rip them on my table saw, but my table saw isn't able to cut all the way through a 4x4, so I set the blade height to half of the width of the 4x4. I'll make a pass, I'll flip it over so that the cut line is now on the top facing me, make my second pass, and that should give us a clean face to work with, a clean edge. So let's go ahead and do that to all 4 of the legs. So once again, to cut through the whole thickness of these 4x4s, I'm going to make my first pass cutting through half of the width of the 4x4, flip it over so that the cut line is now facing me, and make my second pass. This should give us a clean edge to work with. I'll go ahead and do that to 2 of the sides before moving my fence over to cut the final width. That way I only have to move my fence once. Alright guys, before I move on, I wanted to note that I'm only ripping one edge, flipping it 90 degrees, ripping that edge, and then I'll do that to all 4. And then, before cutting the other 2 edges, I'll move my fence to the final width, which in this case will be 3 inches. That way I only have to move the fence once. So, just do one side, flip it 90, do the other side, and then do that to all 4, and then come back and do the other 2 sides. So yeah, let's continue. I was gonna say something else. What was I gonna say? Whatever. I remembered. So I'm cutting halfway through this 4x4 because I'm only taking off a sliver of each side. If you were gonna cut down the middle, I would go maybe 1/4 inch at a time, just little by little raise the blade, just because it's going to be a lot more stress on your blade and that can be a little unsafe. So I'm doing halfway and then halfway because I'm only cutting off a little bit, so just keep that in mind. Alright guys, so I have all of my legs ripped down, and next you just want to take a square. I use a machinist square because these are dead accurate, and just run it along, making sure that it's nice and square, just how we want it. And this is, I mean, as good as you're gonna get, especially since I didn't use a joiner. I'm happy with it, so now we can, don't drop your squares. Now we can move on. With all of our legs nice and square, we can go ahead and start working on the skirts. And once again, I'm starting by cutting off one end, making sure that's nice and square before measuring out any sort of dimension. And for the skirts, I'll be using 2x4s that I'll eventually rip down to 2x3s. After cutting the length over at the miter saw, let's take it to the table saw so we can clean up one edge and then rip it down to our final dimension. Whenever I'm cutting 2x4s or any material that's thicker than 3/4 of an inch, make sure you raise your blade height just a little bit more than you normally would. This allows the gullets to clear more sawdust and it'll keep the blade cooler. Just take your time with these cuts, don't force anything. And for the longer pieces, I'm using my main workbench as my in-feed table, and I also have an out-feed table. If you're working with long stock like this here, make sure you have support on both ends. With everything cut down to size, now is the perfect time to sand. You want to make sure to sand before you make the castle joints, that way you have a perfect fit. You don't want to make the joint first and then sand everything, because that might end up with a loose joint. Also, now's a good time to say thank you to everybody watching. I appreciate those likes, those comments, the people subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, so I really do appreciate you guys. Now we can go ahead and start working on the castle joint. If you didn't watch last week's video, it's an entire video of me making this joint for the first time, so make sure to go watch that if you don't know how to do this. I go into a lot more detail. But briefly, I'm just going to find the center of the 4x4 and then also find the center of the thickness of my skirt. This is going to align my skirt dead center in the 4x4, that way I know what to cut, where to cut, and it takes out a lot of the math. Not going to talk much more on this joint because, like I said, if you didn't watch last week's video, please go do that. Next, we need to know the width of the skirt we're using so we know how deep to cut into the castle joint. To do this, I'm simply taking my marking gauge and setting it to that width, but you can use a combination square or just measure it each time. Then I'll go ahead and carry all of those lines through all 4 sides of the 4x4. Before you start hawking out any material, make sure you set the blade height to the width of whatever skirt you're using. I have mine just so it's flush, if not a little bit below the surface, that way I ensure a perfectly snug fit. Now using my castle joint / tenoning jig, I'll go ahead and cut out all of my waste material. Like I said, if you didn't watch last week's video, I go over all of this in more detail. Now when you first make the cut, make sure you're cutting well inside of the lines, that way you can sneak up to the line as you need to, making sure you have a perfectly snug fit. I kind of messed this up in the video, but you'll see why. Then go ahead and test fit it. Like I said, this first test should be too snug to fit nicely. That way you can take away just a little bit of material, test fit it again, and you should have a perfect fit. So I could have sworn I took away the smallest amount of material, but as you can see here, this joint is way too loose, the skirt is moving around too freely, and I didn't know why until after I turned off the table saw. I realized my tenoning jig completely came apart without me knowing it. So I'll have to redo all of this, make a new tenoning jig, and we should be good to go. So third time's a charm. I went ahead and made a new tenoning jig, made a new leg and a castle joint, and you can see here with a little bit of convincing, this fits nice and snug. Next, we have to start working on the half lap joints, and I want these skirts to stick out 2 inches from the castle joint, so I have to measure these posts that are part of the castle joint. These came out to about 3/4 of an inch, so I'll mark my first line at 2 3/4, and then from that line you'll mark the thickness of the skirt you're using, which in my case is 1.5. Alright guys, if you don't know how to cut half lap joints with the miter saw, I have a video that goes into more detail about this, but basically your miter saws have this little depth stop here and this nut. So you can set it to, let's get that out of the way, set it to whatever depth you want and that'll stop. So I already have my depth stopped to exactly half of this 1.5 inch material. You want to make sure to add a backer. This is going to push your workpiece away from the fence to allow for the deepest part of your blade to cut through. So as you can see, if it was back here, it would only get to about this side of the blade. But if we bring it forward a little bit, we can make sure that we get the lowest part of the blade on there. Does that make sense? It'll make sense. So I'll go ahead and line this up just as you would a cross cut, and then you can chop away. Let's go ahead and do that. So as I mentioned, if you don't know how to cut half lap joints with your miter saw, I'll leave a video down in the description of me showing you exactly how to do that. And just like any other joint, make sure you're cutting inside of your lines and sneak up to the line as you need to. Okay guys, there wasn't a good way to show you since this thing is so big, but everything's fitting nicely. This is just a dry fit. This is what the castle joint will look like with all 3 pieces joined together. So next I'm just going to pop in the other long side and make sure everything fits good. And if it does, then we are pretty much done with the base. Sorry for the shaky camera, but it's huge, so whatever. Just like any other project of this size, it's going to be a lot easier to assemble with 2 people, but if you're by yourself, you can definitely do it. I used a wooden mallet to pretty much convince everything to line up correctly, and all of these joints were still super snug, but not too tight. You don't want it to be too tight or you might get some cracking. You want it to be snug enough. With a little bit of wood glue, it shouldn't be able to move. Before disassembling for your final glue up, make sure you label each joining piece. This is going to ensure that when you go to glue it up, everything lines up the way it did during the dry fit. Okay guys, so next I'm going to add a 1/4 inch round over. And I made a test cut on some scrap, make sure that I have the profile the way that I want it. But I put together just some scrap pieces of ply. That way I can press forward and I don't have to worry about it moving side to side. This way it'll give I'll get a nice consistent pressure all the way through. Make everything nice and pretty. So let's go ahead and do that. Adding a round over or any sort of profile to your legs is definitely optional. But if you decide not to do that, make sure you soften these sharp edges with some sandpaper. You can do it by hand or with a sanding sponge. You just don't want these to be too sharp. Now we can start our glue up. I'm going to start with the short sides of the skirts. This way I can hold the legs up while I'm maneuvering these longer pieces. And don't be shy with the glue. Get a lot of glue in there and make sure to glue the inside of the posts as well. And just like that guys, you have a super sturdy table base and some cool new joinery you can add to your books. Hope you guys like this one. Nope, cable. The microphone wire, I should have plugged in after. Whew. It's hot, man. All right. Okay guys, that's the build. I had so much fun making these joints, especially for something this big. I loved it so much because I know that it's gonna hold up super well over time. And once the glue dries, it's not gonna go anywhere. I might actually add some screws in the center of the joint, just connecting everything even more. It's a little unnecessary. The glue is gonna do most of the work, but you know, you're not gonna see the screws, and why not? But let me know what you guys think. If you haven't watched last week's video where I go into a little more depth about how to make the joints, last week was a video of me doing it for the first time. So learn what I learned, learn the mistakes I made as well, and hopefully you guys can start incorporating this into your tables, your chairs, whatever sort of furniture, and just upping your joinery game. I'm really proud of the way it came out. It's sturdy as hell. I'm gonna let the glue dry a little bit or else I would really shake it to test it, but I'm happy with it. So, as you guys know, if you watched last week, I got a new microphone. The other one was garbage, so I returned it, got another one, and I think this one works a lot better. So I wanted to ask, do you guys wanna see me talking more throughout the videos, or do you just like the voiceover with some little beats behind it? Let me know down in the comments below, but I'm kinda liking having the microphone. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thumbs up if you liked the video. Subscribe if you think I deserved it, and follow me on Instagram at Zuko Builds. See you guys next week. It's so big. Freaking 9, look at this. I'm still inside the table. I'm still inside the table. This is insane. Okay, gotta go under. And I almost forgot, I got too excited sliding around this huge table, but next week I'm gonna build the tabletop. It's gonna be a quicker video, but if you wanna learn how to build a whole table, then tune into next week. So every Monday I post a video, unless something comes up, but usually every Monday. So tune in next week and I'll see you guys then. All right, now I'm done.